There was a night, many years ago, when I sat alone in a small study lit by a single lamp, surrounded by the notes I had gathered from more than 500 of the most successful men of my generation. I had spoken with Andrew Carnegie, observed Henry Ford, studied the silent habits of Thomas Edison, and walked through the libraries of men whose names history would not allow to die. And yet, on that particular night, none of their wealth, none of their factories, none of their patents seemed to me as important as a single discovery I had just begun to understand. I realized that every one of those great men had, at some point in his life, fought the same invisible enemies, not bankers, not competitors, not even circumstances, something older, something quieter, something that lived inside them. I called them in my private notes the 6 ghosts of fear. And the longer I studied the human mind, the more I became convinced that no man ever truly fails because of the world outside him. He fails because of the tenets he allows to live, rent-free, inside the chambers of his own subconscious. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve, but the reverse is also true and far more dangerous. Whatever the mind silently conceives and silently believes about its own limitations, the mind will also achieve with the same terrible precision. I want you to understand something before we go any further. These 6 fears are not emotions in the ordinary sense. They are not feelings that pass through you like a summer storm. They are presences. They are inhabitants. They take up residence in the basement of your mind, and from there they whisper to you in the language of your own voice, so that you mistake their counsel for your own thinking. This is the first deception you must learn to see through. The voice that tells you that you are not enough is rarely your voice. It is the voice of a ghost who learned your accent long ago. I observed in the lives of great achievers that not one of them was a man without fear. Edison was afraid. Ford was afraid. Lincoln was afraid more often than history likes to admit. The difference was never the absence of fear. The difference was that these men learned to identify their ghosts by name. And once a ghost is named, it begins to lose its power. This is one of the oldest laws of the inner kingdom, and the modern man has nearly forgotten it. The first of these tenets is the fear of poverty. I placed it first because in my long years of study, I came to see it as the most destructive of them all. The fear of poverty is not the ordinary concern about money. It is something far deeper. It is a state of mind in which a person becomes convinced, often without realizing it, that lack is his natural condition. He may earn well, he may save, he may even prosper for a time, but the ghost continues to whisper that prosperity is borrowed and that loss is owed. I have seen men with millions in the bank who lived as paupers in their own minds, and I have seen men with little who carried within them the unmistakable atmosphere of wealth. The difference was never in the ledger, it was in the inner climate. But the most surprising part comes only now. The fear of poverty does not come into a man's life because he has been poor. It comes into his life because somewhere in the long corridors of his early years, he absorbed the belief that he did not deserve abundance. Perhaps a parent spoke of money as a cruel master. Perhaps a teacher implied that ambition was a vice. Perhaps the boy watched his father work himself to exhaustion and concluded that wealth was the reward of suffering rather than the reward of thought. Whatever the source, the ghost moved in early, and it has been paying no rent ever since. I once observed a young man of remarkable intelligence who could not for the life of him hold on to money. Every time he advanced, something arose to pull him back. He blamed circumstances, he blamed associates, he blamed the economy. But when I sat with him long enough, the truth surfaced. In the deepest layer of his subconscious, he believed that to become wealthy would mean to betray the people he came from. He had confused poverty with loyalty. And until he saw this, no amount of effort in the outer world could change his condition. The second tenet is the fear of criticism. This one is subtler than the first, and in many ways more dangerous because it disguises itself as humility, as politeness, as social wisdom. The fear of criticism is the reason a man with a great idea remains silent in the meeting. It is the reason a woman with a great book never finishes the manuscript. It is the reason countless human beings carry their most original gifts to the grave. They were afraid of being laughed at. They were afraid of being misunderstood. They were afraid that someone, somewhere, might say a word against them. What Hill said about this subject is deeply unsettling, and I will say it again here, plainly. The fear of criticism has destroyed more potential greatness than any war in human history. It is the silent assassin of the imagination. And the cruelest part is that the criticism a man fears is, in 9 cases out of 10, criticism that would never have come. He invents the courtroom, he invents the judges, he invents the verdict, and then he sentences himself before the trial begins. I have walked among men of immense capability who could not bear the thought of being seen incompletely. They wanted to be admired in their finished form, and so they never permitted themselves to be witnessed in the unfinished form, which is the only form in which growth is possible. The fear of criticism whispers that the world is watching. The truth is, the world is mostly looking at itself. The cure is not to become indifferent to the opinion of others. The cure is to become more interested in the opinion of your definite major purpose than in the opinion of the crowd. When a man knows what he is for, he becomes immune to the noise of those who do not know what they are for. The third tenet is the fear of ill health. This one occupies a strange territory in the human mind because the body and the subconscious are not, as the modern man imagines, 2 separate kingdoms. They are one continuous landscape, and what is sown in the mind is reaped in the flesh. I have observed for many years now that the man who fears illness with a particular intensity is often the man who, in time, begins to manifest the very conditions he most dreaded. This is not superstition. This is the law of suggestion working in the most personal of laboratories, the human body itself. Here begins the darkest game of the subconscious mind. The fear of ill health does not always announce itself as such. Sometimes it dresses up as caution. Sometimes it dresses up as awareness. Sometimes it dresses up as the careful reading of every symptom, the constant scanning of the body for signs of betrayal. But beneath these costumes is a single posture, a posture of expectation. The mind is expecting the body to fail, and the body, being the most loyal servant the soul has ever known, eventually obeys. When a man begins to occupy his mind with images of vitality, with the conviction that he is a being designed for strength, his entire chemistry begins to shift. Autosuggestion is not a parlor trick. It is the most ancient form of medicine known to the human race, and the modern man has nearly forgotten how to use it. The fourth tenet is the fear of loss of love. Of all the 6 ghosts, this one is perhaps the most painful, because it touches the part of us that wishes, above all things, to be held, to be chosen, to be remembered. The fear of loss of love can begin in the cradle, when a child first senses the inconstancy of affection, and it can shape every relationship that follows for the next 60 years. A man under the rule of this fear will sabotage what he most desires. He will test those who love him until they grow weary. He will withhold the very tenderness he hopes to receive. He is not cruel. He is afraid, and his fear has become a strategy. The detail most people overlook is hidden right here. The fear of loss of love is rarely about another person. It is about the self. The man who fears losing love most deeply is, almost without exception, a man who has not yet learned to love himself in his own absence. He needs another to confirm his worth, and so he clings, and so he controls, and so he loses the very thing he sought to preserve. Love cannot survive in a fist. It can only breathe in an open hand. The great achievers I studied who succeeded in love succeeded not because they found the perfect partner, but because they had done the patient work of becoming whole within themselves before joining their life to another. They did not bring a hunger to the table. They brought a fullness, and the fullness invited fullness in return. The fifth tenet is the fear of old age. This ghost has done particular damage in the modern era because the modern world has confused youth with worth, and as a result, every passing year has become, for many people, a quiet tragedy. But I want to suggest to you something different. Old age, in the language of the inner kingdom, is not a decline. It is a refinement. It is the slow burning away of what does not matter. It is the gathering of the harvest after the long labor of the field. The real turning point begins here. The fear of old age is, at its root, the fear of having lived a life that did not amount to what one hoped for. It is the fear of arriving at the end and finding nothing of substance in one's hands. This is why some men, as they age, grow more bitter, while others grow more luminous. The bitter ones are mourning a life they did not live. The luminous ones are celebrating a life they refuse to postpone. The remedy is not to deny age, but to live in such a way that when age arrives, it finds you already full. I have known men in their 80s whose minds were more electric than the minds of men in their 30s. They had refused to retire from the inner work. The ghost of old age cannot enter a mind that is still under construction. The sixth and final tenet is the fear of death. I placed it last, not because it is the greatest, but because in a strange way it is the parent of all the others. Beneath the fear of poverty, beneath the fear of criticism, beneath every other fear, there is this final shadow, the suspicion that one's existence is small, brief, and ultimately insignificant. The fear of death is the ground from which the other ghosts grow. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is something simple and difficult at once. The men who lived most fully were the men who had, in some private hour, made peace with their own mortality. They were not careless. They were not reckless. They were free. They had ceased to bargain with the inevitable, and in that ceasing, they discovered that the bargaining had been the very thing draining their energy. Once a man stops trying to outrun the end, he can finally begin to inhabit the middle. Every man who has ever done great work has done it as if his time were both infinite and finite at once. Infinite enough to plan with vision, finite enough to act without delay. Now, having walked you through the 6 tenets, I must tell you something that took me many years to understand. These 6 fears are not separate creatures. They are 6 masks worn by a single underlying condition, the absence of a clearly defined and emotionally embraced purpose. Where definite major purpose is alive, the ghosts have no room to live. Where it is missing, they multiply, they breed, they take over the house. This is why the men I studied who possessed an unshakable purpose seemed almost untouched by these fears. The fears had nowhere to land in them. The inner ground was already occupied. Modern man has lost the compass of his inner purpose, but not the need for it. This is the great wound of our age. We have built machines that can think faster than us, networks that can reach further than us, libraries that contain more than any human mind can hold, and yet we walk through our days with a strange hollowness, because the one thing we did not build is a clear inner direction. The 6 ghosts thrive in this vacuum. They feed on aimlessness. They grow fat on the indecision of a generation that has confused movement with progress and noise with meaning. Look honestly at the dominant mood of our time. It is not laziness, it is not stupidity, it is anxiety. A low, constant, almost atmospheric anxiety that hums beneath every screen and every conversation. Where does it come from? It comes from the fact that millions of intelligent people no longer know what they are doing with their lives, and the subconscious mind, which abhors a vacuum, has filled the empty space with the only inhabitants available, the 6 fears. The remedy is purpose. The remedy is direction. The remedy is the willingness to choose. Let me speak now about the inner journey itself, because I do not want to leave you with a diagnosis and no path. The first step in evicting the 6 tenets is to name them. I want you to take at some quiet hour a piece of paper and to write at the top a simple sentence. The fears that have been living in me are these. And then I want you to write them out one by one in your own words, not in mine, not in the language of any book, in your own voice, with the honesty you would bring to a private letter that no one else will ever read. This act alone, this naming, begins the eviction. The second step is to recognize that these fears were planted long before you were old enough to consent. They are, in the great majority of cases, inherited furniture. You did not buy them. They were left to you by family, by culture, by the unspoken rules of the world you grew up in. You are not their author. You are only their current resident. And a resident, unlike an author, has the right to redecorate. As long as a man believes his fears are his identity, he cannot release them. The moment he sees that they are inherited tenets, he can begin the long, patient work of asking them to leave. The third step is the construction of a definite major purpose so clear, so emotionally charged, so frequently visited that the subconscious mind begins to organize itself around it. This is not a wish. This is a written, dated, specific declaration of what you intend your life to become. The men I studied did not stumble into greatness. They wrote it down. They spoke it aloud. They visited it daily, the way a gardener visits a young tree. And the subconscious, which is the most obedient servant a man has ever had, eventually accepted the new master and dismissed the old ghosts. The fourth step is the building of a mastermind. No man evicts his fears alone. He does it in the company of 2, 3, or 4 souls who have agreed in a spirit of harmony to think with him toward his chosen end. The mastermind is not a networking group. It is not a circle of acquaintances. It is a sacred council in which minds blend and produce a fifth mind that none of them alone could have produced. Carnegie understood this. Edison understood this. The men who built the modern world did not build it by themselves, and neither will you build the inner world by yourself. The fifth step is the daily practice of autosuggestion. It is the deliberate, repeated, emotionally charged communication between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind. It is the way you speak to yourself when no one is listening. It is the silent sentence you repeat as you fall asleep. It is the picture you carry of the man or woman you intend to become. The subconscious does not respond to occasional visits. It responds to constant residency. Whatever thought you live with, that thought becomes the soil of your future. And now I must speak about the paradox at the heart of all of this, because without it, the rest is incomplete. The 6 ghosts of fear cannot be destroyed by fighting them. The man who fights his fears feeds them because the fight itself confirms their importance. The fears grow stronger every time you treat them as worthy opponents. The light in the struggle is this: the ghosts dissolve not when they are defeated, but when they are no longer needed. They were called into the house originally to protect you from a world that felt unsafe. They were, in their crude way, attempting service. And as long as you treat them as enemies, they will continue to insist on their work. The masters I studied did not slay their fears. They thanked them. They acknowledged the protective function the fears had once served, and then they gently informed the ghost that their services were no longer required. This may sound strange to the modern ear, which loves the language of war. But the inner kingdom does not respond to war. It responds to authority, and authority is quieter than aggression. The man who has discovered his definite major purpose speaks to his fears the way a calm captain speaks to a restless crew, not in anger, not in pleading, in command. This is the great inversion that the spiritual traditions of the world have always known. The East called it the surrender of the ego. The Stoics called it the acceptance of what is not in your power. Emerson, whom I read deeply in my younger years, called it self-reliance, by which he meant reliance on the deeper self that lies beneath the frightened self. The names differ. The principle does not. The man who has surrendered the lower self into the keeping of the higher self has nothing to fear, because the higher self is not subject to the same death the lower self fears. Let us turn for a moment to the historical mirror, because I have found that the lives of great men, when read with the right eye, are not biographies. They are case studies in the eviction of the 6 ghosts. Consider Lincoln. Here was a man who lost election after election, business after business, who buried more than one beloved soul, who walked through years of melancholy so deep that his contemporaries feared for his life. By every external measure, the 6 ghosts had every reason to occupy his house permanently. And yet, somewhere in the long privacy of his nights, Lincoln found a way to hold a purpose larger than his pain. He carried it in the service of something beyond himself. Consider Edison, who failed by his own count somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 times in his pursuit of the incandescent lamp. The fear of criticism could have ended him on the 200th attempt. The fear of poverty could have driven him to safer work. He refused them all. He had a definite major purpose, and the purpose was louder than the ghosts. This is the pattern. This is always the pattern. Consider Carnegie, who began with nothing and ended as one of the wealthiest men of his era. When I first met him, I expected to find a man hardened by his journey. Instead, I found a man strangely free. He spoke of his fortune as though it had been entrusted to him by some larger order. He had evicted the fear of poverty so completely that he was now planning, in the final chapters of his life, to give away nearly everything he had built. This is what happens when the ghosts leave the house. The space they occupied is filled with something else: generosity, vision, service. The inner architecture, once cleared, fills with light. I want to leave you with something practical before we come to the final question. Tonight, before you sleep, I want you to perform a small ritual. Sit in a quiet place, close your eyes, and in the silence, allow each of the 6 tenants to come forward one by one. Do not argue with them. Do not push them away. Greet them. Say to each in your own words, "I see you. I know your name. I know what you have been trying to do." And then with the same calm, say to each, "Your work in this house is finished. I am claiming the space you occupied for a different purpose." Then visualize that purpose in clear and emotional detail, taking up residence in the room the ghost has just vacated. Do this for several nights. Watch what begins to shift. You will not feel transformed in a single evening. The ghosts have lived in you for a long time, and they will test the new authority. But something will begin to move. You will notice that situations which once paralyzed you no longer have the same grip. You will notice that the inner climate has shifted by a degree or two. And in the inner kingdom, a few degrees of warming is the difference between a frozen field and a field where seeds can germinate. I close with the question that I want to leave with you, because this question, in my long experience, is more important than any answer I could offer. If you knew with absolute certainty that the 6 ghosts living in your subconscious were not your true voice, but inherited tenants who would leave the moment you firmly asked them to, what would you begin tomorrow that you have been postponing for years? What letter would you write? What conversation would you initiate? What work would you finally claim as yours? What love would you finally allow yourself to receive? The men I studied did not answer this question in their heads. They answered it with their lives, and the answer they gave in 1,000 different forms was always the same answer at its root. They began. They began before they were ready. They began before the ghosts had finished packing. They began in the middle of the fear itself and discovered that the fear had been bluffing all along. When was the last time you truly listened, not to the 6 tenants, but to the quieter voice underneath them, the voice of the man or woman you came here to become? That voice has been waiting. It has not given up on you. And tonight, when you turn off the light and the house grows quiet, it will be waiting still. The next time we sit together, I want to take you deeper into one of the most powerful and least understood laws of the inner kingdom, the law by which a single burning desire properly held in the subconscious mind becomes the architect of an entire life. Until then, do the work of the eviction. Name the tenants, reclaim the rooms, and remember always that you were not born to be haunted. You were born to be inhabited by something far greater than fear.